Nice to be back, if only virtually, in Chester. It's been a long time since I've actually been over. Um, so what I want to talk about, as you've heard, is the archaeology of the early medieval monastery at Lindisfarne. Now, can I just first of all, can I just check that people can see my screen? That's the priority.
Yep, all good.
Brilliant. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about the early medieval archaeology on Lindisfarne. There's lots of other archaeology to talk about. There's kind of later medieval, there's post-medieval, an amazing kind of military Tudor landscape, 16th and 17th century landscape of military stuff as well, and really interesting industrial archaeology. But I'm an early medievalist at heart, and it's the early medieval archaeology that brought me to do field work on Lindisfarne. You can see on just so you to get a sense of place, you can see on the photograph on the title slide, you can see the ruins of the later post-conquest priory there in the middle with the parish church behind, and you can see some of our excavation trenches at the bottom of the picture. So that's to the east of the main priory. What I'm going to do this evening is I'm first of all kind of set the scene, give you a little bit of background context about Lindisfarne, and then we're going to explore the archaeology, and we're going to kind of take it through three periods. We're going to look at the hints of evidence we have for what was going on the island in the early medieval period, but before the establishment of the monastery. Then we're going to look at it really during its height, from its the official consecration of the monastery, the foundation of the monastery under Oswald and Aidan to the 9th century. And then we're going to look at the 10th century, a period where traditionally we don't really think of there being much going on the island, and see what our archaeology is starting to perhaps suggest a different story. So just a very basic kind of timeline. I'm an archaeologist, so I tend not to deal in individual years. I tend to deal in kind of bands of years. But this is the token history slide. Lindisfarne is founded by Oswald, who is incoming at this point king of Northumbria. He's been in exile in Western Scotland, where he's probably converted to Christianity on the island monastery of Iona. And when he comes in as the new king, he founds a monastery along with a monk from Iona called Aidan, and essentially he seems to be founding an Iona in the east, very close to Bamborough, which is a major royal centre for the kings of Northumbria. So essentially, for the first 30 years, Lindisfarne is a daughter house, for all intents and purposes, of Iona, and is plugged into what we might call a Northern Irish, Western Scottish tradition of Christianity. We're going to try and avoid talking about things like Celtic Christianity, because it doesn't really have much meaning. Then in 664 is a major kind of turning point in the history of the monastery. That's when we have the Synod of Whitby. Up until 664, the royal family of the leading dynasty of Northumbria had been following two kind of parallel traditions of Christianity: this Northern Irish tradition, which came in with Oswald, and a Roman, Kentish, Frankish tradition, which had been brought in by Oswald's predecessor, Edwin. This is causing all sorts of domestic lack of harmony within the royal court. So we have this church council held at Whitby, where the monks of Lindisfarne speak for the Irish church, and we have Wilfrid and Agilbert speaking for the Roman church, and Oswy, who by that point is the king, decides to focus on following the Roman tradition for the kingdom of Northumbria. And this is often given an awful lot of weight in the history, and it's a religious decision, but I think it's a broader decision about which direction Northumbria kind of faces socially and culturally, as much as purely religiously. This leaves Lindisfarne with a problem, because normally the key founding saint would be the founder of the monastery would be the key saint who is culted on the island. But the trouble is, because of the Synod of Whitby, Aidan, who is the founder, is associated with the losing side. So we have this problem where the main founding saint is associated with the incorrect tradition of Christianity. So Cuthbert is key here. Cuthbert comes in to the island, He's connected to the Roman and Kentish traditions of Christianity. He has a reputation for being obviously a good administrator, a reputation for sanctity, and frankly, the best thing Cuthbert ever does for Lindisfarne is he dies. He dies when he's a hermit out on Inner Farne, and he is brought back to the main island of Lindisfarne, where he is first of all buried in a position of honour by the altar, and then 10 years after his burial, his remains are investigated, found to be miraculously uncorrupted, and the body is raised above the ground into an above ground shrine. And that is a process called translation, which is the de facto way in which an early medieval saint was made. There's relatively little paperwork. It was essentially by popular acclamation, and that made Cuthbert the new key culted figure on the island. And we then have a period of around 100 years, the golden age of Northumbria, where Lindisfarne acquires great wealth. It becomes an important centre for pilgrimage. And then, of course, the most famous date associated with Lindisfarne, 793, the first Viking attack. But it's a lot of people seem to think that this kind of destroyed the monastery. It's not true. The monks stay in the monastery for a while. And then we have very confused historical references to what's going on in the 9th century. Alternative stories suggest that the monks left the island in the 830s under Abbot Edgered, and perhaps moved to Norham, which is on the Tweed inland, on a big estate owned by the monastery. And then we have a second story of them leaving the island again in 875. And they move around the north of England before finally ending up in Durham in 8995 and founding a monastery there. And the monastery at Durham is the kind of the successor of the monastery on Lindisfarne. And when the monks left, they took the relics of people like Cuthbert with them, which explains why Cuthbert's shrine is now at Durham. So that's the historical context. It's also useful to think about the landscape context. Some of you will have been to the island, some of you won't, but here's just a map showing you where it is. So we're just about 15 miles south of the Scottish border at the Tweed. Of course, that had absolutely no meaning whatsoever in the period we're talking about. That Anglo-Scottish border doesn't really crystallise till the 11th century. So the island itself is tidal. It's tidal today, and it was tidal in the early medieval period. Bede is very clear about that. And so twice a day, when the tide is down, you can access the island by walking over the sands, and then obviously the tide comes up, and becomes a true island. The sea level hasn't actually changed that much in the immediate vicinity of the island, but there has been some changes in the broader landscape. There's a large area of sand dunes on the north side of the island. Those are almost all related to the Little Ice Age of the late medieval and early post-medieval period. And they clearly overlie earlier medieval field systems. You can see Cordrig or Ridge and Furrow. There's this important early medieval settlement site at Greenshield, which is also covered by sand dunes. Elsewhere in the island, there's been a lot of land drainage, particularly associated with the period of enclosure of the fields in the late 18th century. And you can see from this topographic map on the right, you can see this complex system of drainage channels feeding into this lake known as the Lough, and then drainage channels feeding out towards the harbour. Until the late 18th century, the area of the immediately to the north of the current harbour was underwater. So where it says former lagoon was once open water until we think the 1790s, which means that the headland where the monastery sat was much more conspicuously surrounded by sea on three sides. It's much more of a distinctive headland. And also importantly, the Castle Rock, when we'll be talking about in a minute over here, would also effectively have been a small tidal island in its own right, isolated from the main island of Lindisfarne by at the very least salt marsh, and probably would have been an intertidal area. There's been surprisingly little earlier fieldwork done on the island, unlike say Iona, which has been cut to ribbons by archaeologists, to be frank, and some might say Monk Wimmis and Jarrow, which saw substantial sustained excavation by people like Rosemary Cramp. Lindisfarne has only seen fairly small scale bits of fieldwork. There's been a little bit of some kind of what was essentially clearance activities done in and around the ruins of the priory in the late 19th century, and a bit of work done by Sir Charles Peers, again focusing on the later medieval priory in the kind of 1920s. But when we look at the post-war archaeology, Brian Hope Taylor, very celebrated archaeologist, well known for his quality of his field archaeology, he excavated on the island in 1962, and he dug at this site. Hopefully you can see my cursor. He dug in this area here to the west of the parish church, and he dug down here on this ridge of basalt windsill known as the Huff. He basically completely lost his archaeological mojo there. Rather than doing the big open area excavations for which he was well known, he dug some small slit trenches, and he failed to find a building on the Huff. He was only there for maybe a month. Then not much work for a while until the 70s, when Deirdre O'Sullivan carried out what was essentially planning archaeology, development control archaeology beneath the site of the visitor centre, which is here, and found a tiny bit of early medieval archaeology. And then there's a big project by the University of Leicester and Lampeter exploring a range of archaeology on the island, but not particularly focusing in on the village itself. Deirdre O'Sullivan and Rob Young mainly dug Green Shield, this important early medieval settlement site on the north side of the island. And since then, there's been a little bit of commercial archaeology under the shop where you can buy all the mead. They did a little bit of archaeology there. There was some work here in Castleview Gardens, the north side of the village. Which again, all these excavations are getting tiny bits of early medieval archaeology. But what they all show is that the village is essentially built on top of a large midden of kind of medieval and post-medieval date, and that although early medieval archaeology survives beneath the village, you've got to go down 1.5 meters or more to get to it. So when we started our project, which we was in association with DigVentures, we focused in on trying to identify the areas around the edge of the village where it might be easier to get into the early medieval material. So we carried out a big geophysical survey in 2014, hitting all the green areas you can see, apart from the area of the lagoon and areas to the north of the village. And then in 2016, 2 new projects started simultaneously. Our Durham University DigVentures project, which is still running every year, and it's going to be a 10-year project overall. And also there's a period of excavation as part of a Heritage Lottery funded landscape partnerships project, and they again dug on a number of sites along the Huff, and I'll talk about those briefly later on. So a little bit about our project. As I said, we started in 2016. It's very much a joint production between Durham University and DigVentures. We are through DigVentures. We are a crowd-funded project. We successfully crowd-funded the project every year, and this is entirely due to the good works of DigVentures in promoting and running the project with me. For various practical reasons, we have short seasons because it's expensive and complicated to stay on the island. One of the great things about DigVentures is they have an entirely digital recording system, so everything is recorded digitally. We don't have kind of paper contact sheets or anything like that. And crucially, obviously, everything I say today post excavation is ongoing. So everything I'm saying is kind of a work in progress rather than a final considered report. So first of all, think a little bit about what's happening on the island before the monastery. The area is, first of all, to say the Northumberland coastal plain in that area is heavily occupied in the Iron Age and Roman Iron Age period. Obviously, we're well north of Hadrian's Wall here. There's lots and lots of crop marks on the coastal plain opposite Lindisfarne, and there's no reason to think that there wasn't an active settlement presence on the island itself, though we've yet to identify that. Lindisfarne first appears in historical record, actually with references from the Historia Brittonum, which, although survives in copies later than the 7th century, the earliest references actually seem to refer to activity recorded in hindsight, dating to the late 6th, early 7th century. And we have this reference to a great siege. There's 4 British kings, Irian, Rhydderch, Gwachlaug, and Morcant, who are fighting the Anglo-Saxons who are kind of moving into the area at this period. And we have a reference to the British kings besieging the Anglo-Saxon Theodoric on the island. And I just wonder whether what's going on is a siege, not so much of the island itself, but of the castle rock. Although the castle, which survives now, is much later, it's post-medieval. There is Anglo-Saxon metalwork. We've got this Anglo-Saxon strap end known from the rock, and it's very much like the craggy rock of Bamburgh itself, but also places like Edinburgh Castle, Dumbarton, Dunad. This whole series of early medieval power centres that kind of grow in the northern British and central British context. And we're hoping to try and do some field work on the Castle Rock in the next year or so, in collaboration with the National Trust. So this strap end just provides hints that there might be early medieval activity over there on the Castle Rock itself. But we've also this year realised that we've got evidence for a pre-monastic phase within our trenches. Here you see a picture of an aerial photograph or a kind of photogrammetry model of our trenches. Just to get your references, north to the top, the Priory Church is immediately to the left, to the west of our trenches. Normally we would have one big trench, but unfortunately sod's law decrees that we've got a high voltage cable running straight through the centre, and it keeps the light on the navigation lights on, so we're not allowed to stick a JCB through that. But what I want to focus on here is this big wall, little bit of big wall here. It's about 2 meters thick, and in previous seasons it's certainly seemed to carry on heading to the north a little bit. Now this is always a slight problem for us. It just kind of sat there. We weren't really sure how it fitted into the sequence of things. It's it's big size. We couldn't really think of a context for it in an early medieval phasing, so we were kind of trying to ignore it. It's kind of the elephant in the room, and we were guessing it might be post-medieval, perhaps related to post-medieval redefences on the island. However, there was an area of charcoal which is clearly in association with this wall, and when we got the carbon-14 dates back for that, the carbon-14 dates came back for basically 5th century. Fifth, 6th century, which obviously is before the date of the foundation of the monastery. So our very big strange wall seems to fit into essentially a very late Roman Iron Age or early medieval date. That doesn't help us at all in actually working out what it is. We did, however, this year in our excavations find what's probably a continuation of it running up into the other trench. There's a big gap here. This big round feature I'll mention in passing is a Norman lime kiln. So it does seem to cut the wall, but it does suggest you've got this very big, very substantial boundary feature. And so it's 2 meters thick. The stones in it are massive. It takes about 5-6 people to move those stones out the trench. So it's a really substantial piece of construction. And unfortunately, we don't really understand what it's doing there in an early medieval context. It doesn't really look like anything else early medieval in the surrounding area. So we're still, whilst we've got a better sense of its phasing, we're not really any further in actually understanding what it actually is. So but hopefully next year that'll be one of the things we can start to answer. So there's hints of this early activity, and certainly we know from sites like Whithorn, Port Mahomack, and actually places like Mount Weymouth and Jarrow. All these big monastic sites often have hints of a pre-monastic phase. It's not surprising because these are estates which are good quality farming land being donated to the church. So it's perhaps no surprise to find evidence of pre-existing estate centres or pre-existing activity when the monastery, or before the monastery is founded. And obviously that's one of the things we want to try and better unpick next year. Next year. So now moving on to the main phase of the monastery, what we've got here through covering most of our trench is an awful lot of burials. You can see here lots of burials marked, outlines here. Some of these burials they're all broadly west-east, but they do seem to be on a number of different alignments. I think the key thing to say is that the number of burials is incredibly densely packed. Here's just homing in on a small area. You can get a sense. We've got 1, 2, 3. We actually this year got 2 more burials from here, and basically all these other bits and pieces our skulls. It's a very, very, very heavily intercut cemetery, to the point where we have very few clear grave cuts, just endlessly recut burials. And we regularly find graves where they've cut through earlier graves and they've slung the bones which they've disturbed into the later graves. So although we've got some skeletons, they're often found with bits of other skeletons all kind of mixed up together. Now, luckily, the bone preservation is really good. I'm sure you've heard from Joe about the cemetery at Bowl Hole at Bamborough, which also had fantastic preservation. This is the joys of working in this little area. Most of the northeast has horrible soils, but we get great bone preservation here. So what can we tell about the cemetery? First of all, it's clearly not the monastic cemetery. We know that because we've got men, we've got women, we've got children, and we've got babies. You could be a monk from the age of 7 in the Anglo-Saxon church. We know Bede was 7 when he joined the monastery, but they certainly weren't recruiting babies. And we've got about 2 or 3 now what look like mother and child burials as well. So it's clearly a kind of broad demographic, reflecting either the community who are living on the island, the secular village living on the island, or quite possibly people who've come to the island as visitors and as pilgrims and have died and been buried there. Mostly they are, as you see on the left there, most of them are lying on their back, head to the west, feet to the east, no signs of coffins, no signs of grave goods. We've got a small number where they're lying on their side, and these seem to be the earliest burials. This is a bit unusual, but there are parallels from places like Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow and Pontefract and 1 or 2 other early medieval cemeteries. Now, within our heavily intercut cemetery, we've got thousands of quartz pebbles. Now, these, we don't find them on the island. Quartz pebbles aren't natural to the geology of Holy Island. And there's a big tradition of placing quartz pebbles on graves found in northern Britain, so kind of very north of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and also as far kind of southwest as South Wales. And it does seem to be a kind of broadly non-Anglo-Saxon burial tradition. I think in our case, they're not. We don't get piles of them, but I think it's because they're probably early and they've been cut and cut and cut. So the quartz pebbles have just kind of got disseminated amongst all the kind of burial soils within our cemetery. Other burials are marked out as different. We've got a small number of stone-lined graves, but they're the exception, not the rule. And in terms of chronology, the earliest C14 dates are kind of 8th, 9th century, and they go all the way through to the Norman period. And that's something I'm going to come back to. We're still fairly early in the process of writing up these burials, but obviously we'll be we've got plans for isotopic work and DNA analysis coming up in the future. So watch this space on that front. Another thing associated with Lindisfarne is even before our excavations, there's a large quantity of early medieval stone sculpture known from the island. Most of it wasn't from a clear context. Some of it had come up from burials, some graves dug in the parish church, and most of it was from that kind of southwest corner of the island. So it does seem to be clear that that southwest corner of the island is where the core of the monastery is. And one of the very distinctive elements of the sculptural assemblage on Lindisfarne are these small things, these little round-headed so-called name stones, and they're all about the size of maybe an A4 file pad. They're not very big at all, maybe kind of 40 centimeters high perhaps, but they're all very similar. They have a cross on, various designs of cross. They have names written on them, so recording the people who are buried, burial markers. Sometimes in Latin, there's a small number with with runic inscriptions on, and often they have these kind of sunk insets within the name stone, where presumably there was a glass or metal inset. And these are quite important because when you look at them, if you can imagine these things would have been brightly coloured, they would have been painted, they would have looked very like manuscript pages. And there's a big kind of overlap between the artistic style used in manuscript production, obviously the Lindisfarne Gospels being most famous, but also sculptural production on the island. And these things seem to fit into a broadly 8th century context. Now, we've been finding a whole load of fragmentary name stones. We found about 8 so far, adding to the pre-existing number of 15. I say about because 1 or 2 of the ones we've got are very fragmentary and we're not entirely sure they're name stones, but you get a sense of what we're getting. And I think crucially to say is ours are very broken up and I'll perhaps talk a little bit about why they might be broken up a bit later on. But they've got names, and they're clearly part of that broader namestone tradition. And what I'm going to talk about now about the sculpture is very much based on ongoing work by our PhD student Christina Smith. As I said, they've got this real overlap in their kind of style between the manuscript art and this kind of flat two-dimensional sculpture, and you can see that even on this one particular, where you can actually see we've got registers, lines laid out to guide the sculptor, and it's very similar to the kind of dry point kind of marking out of manuscript pages you get. Also, the fact that there's kind of a lower register here has been marked out by lines and not being used. One wonders whether this means that these things were being made kind of blank, prepared blank, and then just filled in as and when somebody died. And in this case, they didn't need to take the inscription onto second line. That's certainly just one possibility. We've got other bits of sculpture, and some is quite unusual. This is my favourite piece because it's one of the first pieces we found. We found the bottom piece here, and then 2 years later, we found the top bit, which is quite nice to get them joining together. And you can see what we've got on the left here is essentially it's a cross. That there's kind of cusped expanded arms, which you associate with the kind of cult of Cuthbert, and either side of these little subsidiary side crosses. Now, there's no parallels for that anywhere in the sculptural repertoire of Northumberland or County Durham, but there's a really nice comparison with this stone on the right, which is a so-called Golgotha stone from Whithorn in Western Dumfries and Galloway, over in the Rins of Galloway. It's a very similar stone, very similar size as well. And Whithorn, of course, was a Northumbrian Episcopal and monastic centre. So it's nice to find a parallel to our stone within the Northumbrian church. There's also broader parallels further west into Ireland and into Scotland as well. Another piece we got, which is very interesting, is this very small piece we got this year. It doesn't look very impressive, but it's part of what is clearly a high cross, and there's some of the good parallels we can see from the kind of repertoire found elsewhere in Northumbria. So most of the sculpture within Lindisfarne fits relatively late in the sequence of Anglo-Saxon early medieval sculpture, and this kind of high cross is kind of 8th, 9th century, so presumably about the same date as our namestones, but we don't actually have that many examples of that kind of sculpture on the island. So our little bit again is rather interesting. But again, I'd ask you to note the way it's fragmented. It's really been bashed around. This is from a cross shaft, which is probably easily 6 foot high, if not more. So a solid bit of stone, but it's been really badly broken up. This is more than kind of plough damage. This is something really quite substantial. Really interesting stone we found this year came up. This is on the stone itself. This kind of red sandstone tablet essentially is very similar in dimensions to these namestones, and almost looks like a roughly kind of roughed out namestone. But rather than having the kind of cross and inscription which we saw on the other ones, you can see we've got this very lightly etched symbol on it, and it's not a cross in the sense it's kind of 45 degrees out, so it looks more like a St Andrew's cross, and I've accentuated it slightly there. So I mean, this is a bit odd. We're not quite sure what it is. It's from the cemetery area, but we haven't really found any parallels. It could just be kind of doodling, but it's placed very centrally on this little piece of stone. We're wondering whether it's an attempt to rough out or design a piece of manuscript art, and we do have parallels to this kind of mixture of diamonds and triangles and little circular patterns on a range of manuscripts from the kind of 8th and 9th century. So it's an intriguing piece which we're still trying to really understand. But although most of our cemetery, our digs, our trenches are dominated by the cemetery, we do have other things going on. We've got an area of industrial activity. So here we are in the northwest corner of our trench, and you can see this is part of our Norman lime kiln, which we've in course of excavation. But what we've got down here are the remains of a building, very simple stone post pads essentially, and at least one post gully with post holes. This feature 239 here, and from here we've got a couple of features. These two features, orange features, inside the structure. One of them both of them contain evidence for metalworking. We've got quite a lot of evidence for iron smithing, so things like hammer scale. And it's possible that this big feature here, quite a deep pit, might be a base for an anvil. We've also got in this smaller orange feature a dump of copper alloy working debris, so things like drips of copper alloy, small possible ingots, and other features. No mold fragments, unfortunately, and we're fairly happy that these are all early medieval, because we've got carbon 14 dates for both charcoal in the gully of the building and from this feature here, which kind of sits everything broadly in a 8th, 9th century context. So it's quite clear that although we've got cemetery, we also have metalworking very, very close. And that really echoes what's found at other sites, for example, Whithorn, where the cemetery goes in and out of use with phases of metalworking and then new phases of burial replacing it. In terms of finds, we've got our lovely playing piece on the left. So this is a tiny glass playing piece. It's about 12, 13 millimeters high, because you sense how tiny these little baubles are. It's quite Christmassy, doesn't it? This is probably for playing either Nefertafel or one of the early medieval Tafel games, and it's part of a broad world of early medieval board gaming, which we find evidence for at Lindisfarne, but there's a lovely parallel to our playing piece from Dundurn, which is a Pictish hill fort in Perthshire, and then Großstromkendorf, which is an early medieval emporia trading site over in the Baltic. And there are kind of broadly similar things from a number of other sites, which shows that the things going on at Lindisarne are part of not just the Anglo-Saxon world, not just part of the kind of Western world, but part of the broader world of North Sea elite culture. And this kind of thing is elite culture, because playing boards, playing games, these kind of board gaming pieces are found in boat burials. They're found associated with high status graves. So they seem to be part of the kind of cultural kit of the early medieval elite. Now, obviously, as well as lovely shinies like that, we've got a range of increasing range of faunal remains, particularly coming in from the area around our industrial area. So you've got the usual range of usual suspects: horses, cattle, deer, pig, sheep and goats, that kind of thing. But also, not surprisingly, given we're an island, we've got puffin bone, we've got gull, we've got guillemot, and it's not surprising to find these things were part of the diet in much of the North Atlantic world well into the post-medieval period, and certainly things like puffin are still eaten on bits of North Iceland, and gannet is still eaten in a small scale in the Outer Hebrides. So it's not surprising that the monks and the people who are living on the island are exploiting these resources. Which brings us in more widely to the other evidence for maritime resources. We're getting increasing evidence that both sea fish and shellfish are part of the diet in the early medieval monastery. So we've got things like cod and monkfish and ling and conger eel, and some of these things are clearly quite relatively deep water fish. Cod are fish they can swim along the bottom, so these are clearly being caught by people going out into the sea, presumably catching them with long lines rather than nets. But also there's other fish which are perhaps more associated with shallower waters and perhaps the intertidal mudflats. We've also got lots of evidence for exploitation of things like oysters. We're finding more and more oysters, but periwinkles, limpets and whelks. And before anyone asks, no, we don't think they're making pigment out of those whelks. You can make a purple dye out of dog whelk, but it leaves quite a distinctive kind of impact on the shells, and we haven't seen that so far on any of the shells we've recovered. We're also getting evidence for the use of seals and whale at the moment. We're getting seal bone, and seals can obviously be used for meat, but also for the oil and for their hide. I mean, there's references to seal hide being used for ropes. I went down a complete wormhole on the internet on YouTube of kind of Inuit cooking videos, because I was trying to work out how do you render down a seal in a world where you don't have big iron cauldrons. And basically, if you leave a seal in a pot for long enough, it'll just kind of self-render, which must have felt really unpleasant. We've also got increasing numbers of bits of whalebone, and whalebone's been found in other early medieval contexts on the island. What we've got here from our excavations is what looks like a fragment of squamous bone, so it's part of a jawbone, possibly a killer whale, and you can see there's cut marks on it here. We don't think they're actively hunting whale, but whales would have been quite commonly beached on the coast of the North Sea. So I think that's probably what's going on there. They're exploiting the beached whale. If anybody's familiar with the Frank's casket, this wonderful piece of carved whalebone of probably Northumbrian date from the 8th century. You can see it in the British Museum, and that actually has a little almost haiku-like inscription explaining that it's made from the bone of a great whale that has beached itself on some shingle. Nice discovery this year, a fragment of a comb. We've not got many personal items. We've got a dress pin somewhere else and a bit of a strap end. But this is rather nice. It's been suggested to us that this cable pattern along the edge by Ian Riddler has suggested that it might indicate has Irish affinities, which is interesting. But it also has a very finely incised runic inscription, which has been translated as saying ... question mark EDE. So we haven't quite got a proper understanding of what that said. I thought it might just going to say comb, but it doesn't say comb, but it does say something. So it might be someone's name, possibly it might be an ownership mark. We're also getting increasing quantities of coinage, particularly from the mid 8th century, and then again in the kind of mid 9th century. Most of the coins are minted in Northumbria, so we've got kind of early shutters, then stikers, but we've also got some coins from a little bit further afield, such as on the right, this rather nice lunette coin of Ethelred I of Wessex. So it's a reminder that Lindisfarne is a place of exchange, and that those exchange networks might be quite widespread. So that kind of takes up the point in that mid 9th century, where we have this story of the monks leaving Lindisfarne with Cuthbert and the relics of Cuthbert. And this is part of the kind of foundation legend of how the monastery ends up at Durham. But most of the evidence for this very much comes from a series of broad, essentially Norman histories promoted and written by monks from the community of St. Cuthbert in Durham, particularly Simeon of Durham, who were trying to explain how they have ended up in Durham. But increasingly, this very simple story that everybody leaves and then pitches up in Durham 100 years later is problematic. First of all, even in Simeon, but it's a very confusing story because we've got this double departure. It's departure recorded twice, once in broadly kind of 830 to 845 and once in 875, with the monks kind of moving twice under two different abbots. What's certainly interesting is that a lot of our coins come from the period between these two narratives. So certainly if the monks did move 830 and 845, there was the coins indicate a continued presence on the island in that period. But the story gets more complicated, and I'm going to focus in here on the kind of our what we're calling a tomb shrine, which is on our eastern trench down here in the southwest corner of our eastern trench. What we've got, it's a not brilliant photo. That's why I couldn't find the post-ex photo when I was putting together the PowerPoint. But what we've got is the only grave so far we've found where the stone lining essentially projects above ground. It's a curb above ground. And we've got, they're very crude, but they're essentially corner posts and these big wooden curbs, and then an infill with rubble. Now, it is by itself that's intriguing, but I want to point you to this burial right next to it, and it is really hard up right next to it, where we've got our only burial with a coffin, and it's essentially it's one of these things. It's one of these Northumbrian chest burials which belong to the 8th or 9th century, and I have to emphasize this, apart from this we have no evidence for coffins at all in any of our cemetery. But what we have got is this. We've got a series of nails marking out the kind of perimeter of the coffin, and then we've got this socking great big bit of of plate iron. We can see with some of that wood still intact. And what this is part of a lock plate for one of these big wooden chests. Now, these big wooden chests are found used in burials in a Northumbrian context in broadly the 8th, 9th century, but not really found elsewhere in early medieval England. And they seem to be large chests which are probably used as furniture or stores during life, and they have these elaborate straps and these big locks on them. But they sometimes seem to be reused for burial. And in our case, what we've got is now the most furtherly northern example in the known distribution of these things. So we've got something going on with our nice little grave, and but our second unusual burial, unusual because of this coffin, right up against it. And also notably, this burial right up against it is not being intercut like many of the other graves in the immediate vicinity. We then got some really interesting finds from the immediate area. We've got a penny of Edward the Confessor, which was found essentially in the rubble on top of the tomb shrine. Again, so that's from the period where the monks are meant to have left. We've also got this thing. It's a fragment of green porphyry. Now, green porphyry is a very unusual stone. It's only found from one particular island in the East Mediterranean, in the Greek islands. In this case, it's got clear evidence for sawing on the back, and the front has been polished. And these things are known in early medieval contexts, where they seem to be associated with things like shrines and portable altars. What's interesting is when we look at the distribution of green porphyry from Britain, it's it's broadly 9th, 10th century in date. So again, the period when the monks aren't meant to be on the island. But also it has a broadly kind of Hiberno-Norse distribution. So there's bits of this found at places like Bornish and Kevester and Bruff of Bursay, then monastic sites like High Island off the west coast of Ireland, St Ninian's Isle, then places like Dublin and Waterford. So these things seem to be entering Britain through broadly Hiberno-Norse spheres of interaction. And it's an important reminder that we always think of the Vikings as being kind of inimically hostile to Lindisfarne and the monks, but actually there's a much more ambiguous relationship. So, for example, by the time we get into the 10th century, we know that the community of St. Cuthbert are essentially acting as kingmakers. They crown one of the Vikings as king of the Northumbrian area. They get land. Land goes both to and from the monasteries and the Vikings in both directions. And we know that we have things like people like Guthred gifting the community of St. Cuthbert with honor and gifts, and one wonders whether this fragment of porphyry is one of those gifts. But the key thing is we have here a tomb shrine which probably has its origins maybe in the 8th century, if that's the date for the burial next to it, but seems to continue to be acting as a focus for devotion and activity into the 10th century, with things like the presence of this green porphyry being a particular indicator of some kind of devotional activity. So the activity at Lindisfarne in the 10th century is not purely economic. It's not the islands just turned into a secular farmstead or something. We seem to have active continuity for devotional practice. And interestingly, when we look at some of the other burials in the area, this burial here, which we've got a C14 date, again has a 10th century date, again suggesting kind of adding to our hypothesis that we've got an area of devotional activity in the 10th century when the monks aren't really meant to be around. But we also have other evidence which argues for a good presence there on the island in this dark century. From a sculpture. Now this year we got this fragment here. It's not very nice. It's a horrible bit of sculpture. There's almost certainly a fragment, probably unfinished, of one of his hammer-headed crosses, of which here's some parallels from elsewhere in Northumberland. And again, these seem to fit best in a 10th century context. And this leads us to the bigger kind of issue, is that when we look at the sculptural assemblages from Lindisfarne, most of the sculpture dates, and the best sculpture, to be honest, the most impressive sculpture, dates to the point after which the monks are meant to have left. There's certainly evidence for sculpture before that, but all this stuff on the right hand side is from the period when the monks are no longer meant to be on the island. And it's important because to create this kind of sculpture you need the theological knowledge to design this stuff, because the design is quite complex, the artistic ability to design it and physically produce it, and also we need patronage as well. So there's quite a lot of kind of social relationships embedded in these sculptures. So the continued presence on the island is really quite intriguing. It's also interesting to go back, useful to go back and look at some of the other textual evidence. If you kind of ignore the Simeon of Durham school of histories about what's going on at Lindisfarne in this period, actually there is other evidence suggesting that something carries on the island. And I owe this entirely to the work of Neil McGuigan's fantastic PhD from 2015. We've got dates for an attack on the island by the Scots in 893. So a reminder that it's not just the Vikings attacking in Lindisfarne, it's the Scots. 941, we've got an attack on Lindisfarne, Tillingham and Oldham by Olaf Guthferthson, and certainly Tillingham and Oldham are both monastic sites in this period. Another attack by the Scots at the turn of the millennium. Then, interestingly, in a document which records the burial place of saints from the kind of early to mid 11th century, that records Cuthbert's bones still being at Norham, at least, if not actually not further south, which again suggests that the kind of the centre of gravity for the community of St Cuthbert at this date was still very much Northumberland rather than down in County Durham, as happened later. And as late as 1069, the monks flee to Lindisfarne in the face of the advent of the Normans, suggesting they must have known there was something there for them to actually flee to. So that kind of brings me to the end of what we've been going through. And I think the key take home is that we've got a cemetery, we've got various interesting things going on. But for me, the most exciting stuff we've been getting over the last couple of seasons is this evidence that we've got continued presence on the island in the 10th century, post-Viking attacks, and that presence on the island is substantial and devotional and religious, and not just a continued presence of a secular community. And those of you who've read the latest issue of Current Archaeology have probably read the fantastic article by Adrian Maldonado and others talking about precisely the same kind of thing going on at Iona, where Iona has what they've called a zombie narrative, that everything disappears because of the Vikings. And their evidence, the same kind of evidence we're getting, shows a continuity of activity at Iona, and rather pleasingly, that's the story we're starting to tell at Lindisfarne. So I'll leave it there with the usual slide of thanks and logos. So there you go.